Hello, my name is Joshua Arledge, and I'm a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing. Today, I wanted to hop on to provide some tips and best practices for classroom arrangements when you have a student who is deaf or hard of hearing that is using an ASL interpreter to access communication. So, there are three people that you need to keep in mind when you're coming up with your seating arrangements. That includes the deaf and hard of hearing student, the positioning of the interpreter, and the positioning of the teacher. So, teachers who do not have experience working with a deaf or hard of hearing student or who have never worked with an ASL interpreter oftentimes come up with a seating arrangement that looks something like this. They may think that by putting the student who is deaf or hard of hearing along with the interpreter kind of off to the side, maybe they think, this will decrease distractions for the deaf or hard of hearing student. Maybe they think if the interpreter is sitting there with the student, they can maybe help them through assignments, which is typically not the role of an interpreter, actually, in most cases. So this is not the ideal seating arrangement. Another reason that this is not ideal is because the deaf or hard of hearing student is kind of being off to the side. They're not being included with their peers. And the whole point of having a deaf or hard of hearing student in the general education classroom is inclusion. So this isn't a very inclusive seating arrangement. Um, so a better seating arrangement might look something like this. Here, we have the student sitting with peers. They're not off to the side, they're included in the classroom. They have a seating arrangement similar to that of their peers. And another important thing to note is that the student is able to see the board, the teacher, and the interpreter all in the same line of view. Okay. If you sit the student in a position where they have to choose to look at the teacher or choose to look at the interpreter, you have two people that are kind of fighting for the student's attention. Of course, the ASL interpreter is facilitating communication, which is super important, but oftentimes deaf and hearing, they are used to getting information through their eyes. So they're picking up on visual cues from the teacher, from their peers. They should be able to see their teacher and interpreter at the same time. So they're not having to choose between language or choose between direct visual cues. You want to give them access to both of those things. Also, you'll see that the teacher's desk is somewhat nearby. This might not always be necessary, but for a student who has other accommodations, perhaps they have an accommodation that requires teachers to check for comprehension more frequently or to provide instructions on an assignment multiple times, it could be convenient to have the student somewhat near the teacher so that the teacher can check in with the student as frequently as necessary. Now, this is a setup for instruction. Now, if maybe the teacher teaches a lesson, gives instructions on what the student should now do, maybe it's independent work, maybe it's small group work, the interpreter could then move to sit across from the deaf or hard of hearing student. So you might want to reserve a desk within this group of students, reserve a desk for the interpreter to sit when they are working independently or in small groups. So the teacher taught the lesson, gave the instructions. Now the interpreter might sit across from the student to help facilitate communication within the small group, or maybe to interpret parts of the assignment if the student receives that as an accommodation. Now, if you're working perhaps with an older student, you might have your classroom set up something like this with rows of desks, a bit more traditional. In that case, you could consider having the student sat near the front of the classroom where they're able to clearly see the board, see the teacher, and the interpreter. At this level, you might not need the student sat close to the teacher, but depending on your needs, you can consider that. The important thing here is that the student is sat similarly to their peers, being alienated on some other side of the room, and they have access to both the interpreter, the teacher, and the content that might be shared on the board. Now, this is slightly less typical seating arrangement, but this is actually a really great arrangement for students who are deaf or hard of hearing who are using an interpreter. So it might be something you want to consider if you have the space in your classroom to do a setup like this. So here, The student who is using the interpreting services is able to see all three things: the teacher, the board, and the interpreter, while at the same time being able to see their peers. This is great when you're having students who are participating in class. Maybe they're raising their hand to share an answer to a question, or to uh, question. The student can actually look, for example, if the student sat over here that's raising their hand to share something, the student would be able to see the student who's speaking. They'd be able to look at the interpreter as well, kind of shift back and forth so that they're able to see the speaker and the interpreter, and then also be able to clearly see the teacher when the teacher then responds to the student's comment. So this is a great arrangement that feels really inclusive, because it allows the student to not just spend all day looking at the interpreter, but to actually have the chance to look at their peers. For small group work, maybe you're having a like a resource type class with a student and maybe a couple other peers, or maybe you're having writing conferences, or anything that would involve the student and a smaller group of peers. In a case like this, you could use kind of like this sort of table where you have the teacher and the interpreter sitting together on one side, and then the students on the other side, with a clear line of access for the student to see the interpreter and their. Or if you're using a circle sort of desk, or even like a square sort of desk, you could set up an arrangement like this where you have the deaf or hard of hearing student sat across from the interpreter and the teacher, while also being able to see their peers here on both sides. So, a special consideration if you're doing something on the computer, maybe in the computer lab, if students are maybe from an English class or going to type up assignments or do research, you might consider a setup sort of like this, where the students are able to see their computer screens, and the teacher and interpreter are both then on the other side. So the student can glance at their screen, look up at the teacher, at the interpreter, um, without having to move around too much, turn different ways. So this is a great consideration for computer-based activities. Now, just a couple other things I kind of wanted to highlight when talking about working with students who are using ASL interpreting services. If you do not or cannot, set your classroom up in one of the exact arrangements that I mentioned, that's okay. We definitely do not want to sit students who are deaf or hard of hearing in a different seating arrangement than their peers, as that just does not feel inclusive. If it's a younger student, the student might even feel like they are in trouble, or they're being punished by having to sit, in some other area. So you definitely want to take that into consideration so that they have equal access to their peers. If you're working with an older student who's maybe well versed and having an interpreter in the classroom, you can also consult the student directly and ask, what do you think would be the best seat in the classroom for you while we're having a lecture? Or, where would you like for your interpreter to be when I'm giving a class, or when I'm giving instructions, or when there's a group project? How would you like to go about that? So you can consult the student when appropriate, but you can also always ask the interpreter if you're working with a younger student who might not have that ability yet, the skills to determine their best seating arrangement. The interpreter can serve as a resource to help you determine the best environment for visual access for the student. So those are my tips. And like I said, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to the educational interpreter. Or if there's a teacher of the deaf or hard of hearing who is serving your student, you can also reach out to them. Thank you so much.